Hello, good morning. This is 11 Days with Fran. A few of you have noted that this clock behind me looks like Cogsworth from Beauty and the Beast, which I think is pretty accurate. It hasn't started talking to me yet, but you know, a few more weeks of lockdown and you never know. How lovely to have you, so many of you join already. I know you're from all over the world, lots of you here in England, where I am, where it's sunny, but many of you in Australia and New Zealand and the US, a couple of you in Skye, in Scotland. How lovely, lucky you, nowhere prettier. It's Friday today. Some of you are celebrating Good Friday, and so go grab yourself a cup of tea and maybe a hot cross bun. Not for me, I can't stand hot cross buns. They're like Christmas cake. Ugh. But you know, live and let live. So this is how 11 Days with Fran works. You get a cup of tea and a piece of cake, a hot cross bun if you must, and I read you a short story. Today's short story is called Sunday Morning, confusingly, it being Friday morning, but you know, nobody's perfect. Today's short story is called Sunday Morning by Dorothy Whipple, and it's one of Dorothy Whipple's latest stories, written in 1961, so towards the end of her writing career. And this story, Sunday Morning, since the first time I read it, I just haven't been able to get it out of my head. So it's a weirdly shocking story, like very transgressive. People who say Dorothy Whipple are sort of, that Dorothy Whipple's writing is trivial perhaps, are clearly just not listening properly, because this is one of the most transgressive short stories you will ever hear. You do have to listen carefully though, so but by the end you'll see what I mean. Okay, lovely. Oh, joining from LA as well. That's nice. Everyone settled? Got their cup of tea? Their piece of cake? All right, let's go. Sunday Morning by Dorothy Whipple. At breakfast on this Sunday morning, John West propped up the paper and hid behind it. He didn't like doing it. Phyllis must think he was beginning to get like Robert already. Robert had been Phyllis's first husband, and one of the things that had hurt her about him, she'd confided, had been his habit of reading the papers throughout breakfast. During the 6 months of their pretty nearly blissful marriage, John had not once read the papers at breakfast. But this morning, he had to pretend to. He must screen his face from those wonderful blue eyes, or, such was Phyllis's power of intuition, she would divine that he was up to something. After that, it would only be a matter of time before she got it out of him that he was actually going to see Robert today. Then, naturally, she'd be horrified. She would suspect him of disloyalty to her. She would prevent him from going. He didn't know how, but he knew she would do it. He could not withstand Phyllis. He was either too weak or he loved her too much. He preferred to think the latter. So he kept out of sight behind his newspaper. He must see Robert today. He could bear the load of what he thought of as his own treachery no longer. When he came back from Malaya with no home and no job, the plantation had been ruined by terrorists. It was Robert, his friend from boyhood, who had taken him in. It had been wonderful for a time to live with Robert and Phyllis, but alas, he fell terribly, uncontrollably in love with Robert's wife. He left the flat, and Phyllis followed him. John had never faced Robert again. After the divorce, John and Phyllis married and were ecstatically happy, or would have been, John felt, but for the thought of his betrayal of Robert. Phyllis didn't seem to mind about Robert. John couldn't understand it, but was glad. It was wonderful to have made her so happy that she regretted nothing. "Have you really no regrets at all?" he fondly asked her once. "Only for the dining room curtains," she said, laughing. He took it for a joke, but it wasn't. Phyllis was good at interior decoration, and the material of her former dining room curtains was something quite special, which she'd been unable to get again. Phyllis had thrown herself heart and soul into the furnishing of their present flat. After 6 months, she was still at it. There were new purchases almost every day. John was finding it rather a strain on his finances. His new job in London was not half as well paid as his old one in Malaya. But he told himself he must make allowances for the first year of marriage. Once they were set up, as Phyllis called it, there would be no more to buy. They could economise then. Once, When he diffidently disclosed the state of his bank balance, Phyllis suggested they should ask Robert for a few of the things she might have brought away with her but had left behind, such as the dining room curtains, for instance. John had been shocked, but she laughed at him. "Oh, Robert doesn't care two pins for things like that," she told him. "He never even sees them. He's not like you, darling. You do appreciate what I do. You do admit the rooms are beautiful, don't you? You do like them." John said he certainly did, but he could never take anything more from Robert. "I took you," he said. "I took everything that made life worth living." And Phyllis kissed him and said he really was sweet. But in spite of kisses and blandishments, remorse had worked so strongly in John that at last he rang Robert up to ask if he could see him. Robert's voice sounded just as usual, just as friendly, just as if nothing had happened between them. John was moved almost to tears when Robert fixed Sunday morning. "It's very good of you, Robert," he said with emotion. "Not at all," said Robert. And now Sunday morning was here. John's hand shook a little as he passed his cup round the paper for more coffee, but Phyllis was too engrossed in her own affairs to notice. John needed no alibi for his visit. Phyllis rarely appeared in the public eye until after lunch, and he usually went for a walk by himself in the park on Sunday morning. When it was time, he sought her out where she was rearranging the spare room. She was always rearranging the rooms, kissed her and set out. Robert still occupied the flat he'd shared with Phyllis, and as John walked down the familiar street, wide and empty and Sunday calm, he was overwhelmed with shame. What an appalling thing he'd done to Robert. He could never make reparation, but he could at least let Robert see that his remorse was genuine. He could tell Robert that he'd never meant to rob him of Phyllis. The whole thing had simply been too much for him. He'd broken under it and betrayed his best friend. He climbed the 3 steps and stood before the dark blue door. The card above the bell of the ground floor flat was a fresh reproach to him. Once it had been inscribed Mr. and Mrs. Robert Mount, and now someone had run a pencil through the Mrs. With bowed head, John rang and waited. A pleasant, middle-aged housekeeper answered. His name could have conveyed nothing of his disgrace to her, or she wouldn't have smiled as she did. She took his hat and opened the sitting-room door for him. "Hello, old man," said Robert, coming towards him. With difficulty, John controlled his emotion. It was too much, too magnanimous altogether. He grasped the offered hand convulsively and couldn't speak. "Come and sit down," said Robert, leading him to the fire and sitting himself down. He reinstalled a cat he'd evidently removed from his knee to greet his visitor. A cat was a new departure, thought John. Phyllis would never permit cats. She said they scratched the furniture. But John was glad Robert had a cat, though no substitute for Phyllis. A cat was at least something. "Well, how are you?" said Robert cheerfully. "Both all right? Good." He offered his tobacco pouch. "You like this mixture?" he said. "Oh, no thanks," said John, taking a cigarette of his own. "Oh, I forgot," said Robert. "Phyllis doesn't allow pipes, does she? So you've given up yours, and I've gone back to mine." He smiled genially, filled and lit his pipe, and propped his feet against the fireplace. Since there was a dark patch on the Adam mantelpiece which Phyllis had had stripped, pickled and put in, it was probably the usual place for his feet. John was shocked. He couldn't keep his eyes away from the dark patch. Robert knew perfectly well that Phyllis wouldn't like it. "Will you have a drink?" asked Robert. "Oh, no thanks, not in the middle of the morning," said John with constraint. He would have welcomed such stiffness on Robert's part. This easy assumption that nothing out of the ordinary had happened between them made him feel worse than ever. "I've got Mrs. Dobbs to make us some coffee then," said Robert. "Oh, not for me, please." "Oh, do you good. You look cold or something." He rang and the pleasant housekeeper appeared. "Could you produce some coffee, Mrs. Dobbs, do you think?" said Robert. "Certainly, sir," she said, smiling, and withdrew. "Lot to be said for a housekeeper," said Robert, with an appreciative wag of the head. "Robert," John burst out miserably, "I'm so sorry for what I did." Robert turned. "Already?" "What do you mean already?" said John. "I was sorry all the time. To rob you of Phyllis, to abuse your hospitality." Oh, I see," said Robert. "I thought... Oh, but never mind. Carry on, old chap. I see you want to get something off your chest. What is it?" "What is it?" repeated John. "What else could it be but to tell you how sorry I am?" Robert puffed at his pipe and said nothing. I played the world's dirtiest trick on you, said John with emotion. But you've been avenged, all right, he went on in a moment. The thought of your unhappiness has ruined what might, in other circumstances, have been perfect happiness for me. Robert held his pipe with one hand and stroked the cat with the other. An odd expression was puckering his face. For one awful moment, John wondered if Robert was going to break down. On the contrary, it was laughter Robert suddenly gave way to. Very briefly, he quickly suppressed it. I say, old man, he said, almost sucking in his cheeks, you shouldn't have distressed yourself like that. As a matter of fact, I didn't at all mind your taking Phyllis off my hands. John gaped in amazed silence. It was the most outrageous statement he'd heard in his life. You didn't mind, he repeated at last, in what was no more than a whisper. No, said Robert, shuffling down more comfortably in his chair and changing the position of his feet against the mantelpiece. John stared, and as he stared, a dark suspicion began to push its way through the turmoil of his feelings. Perhaps you wanted to get rid of your wife, he said. Perhaps you brought me into your house with that end in view. Oh, don't be an ass, said Robert calmly. You know very well I was never a calculating sort of chap. He puffed at his pipe while John digested the truth of that statement. But when it did happen, said Robert, I must admit it was a considerable relief. John fell back in his chair. What I've gone through on your account, he said with feeling, all unnecessary. Well, quite, agreed Robert, but there you are. You were always like that, always putting yourself in the other fellow's place. It doesn't do, you know. Mrs. Dobbs came in with the coffee. Shall I pour out or not, sir? She asked. Yes, you do it, Mrs. Dobbs, said Robert comfortably, and John had to wait with what patience he could. When she was gone, he burst out again. I don't understand you. You and Phyllis always seem to get on together. Oh, we got on, admitted Robert, stirring his coffee carefully so as not to disturb the cat. We had to. There was nothing else for it. But I was worried to death for years. I couldn't keep up with Phyllis's expensive tastes. I never had a penny for myself. But perhaps you've more money than I had. You know I haven't, said John bitterly. Robert shrugged his shoulders as if to say that was John's affair now. You're not implying that Phyllis left you for me because she thought I had more money than you, I suppose, said John angrily. Oh, dear me, no, said Robert, hastening to deny any such idea. Phyllis wouldn't think of that. She wouldn't think of anything. She never does. John sat in silence. Oh, no, said Robert soothingly in a moment. I'm only just explaining that I'm very comfortable, and if you are too, then everything's turned out for the best. I think it's abominable, said John. Most immoral, that's all. Nay, come, said Robert mildly. Who are you to talk about morals? There was no collusion, I assure you. I'd have put up with Phyllis for the rest of my life if I'd had to. But you came and fell in love with her, and you went off together without consulting me. And if it's turned out that I'm not exactly broken-hearted, well, you're not going to object to that, are you? Did you want me to be broken-hearted then? No, said John, of course not. Then what are you complaining about? Well, I'm not complaining, muttered John. I'm surprised, that's all. Life is surprising, admitted Robert equably. Have some more coffee. No thanks, said John, feeling strangely depressed. Well, I will, said Robert, helping himself and clapping his feet against the mantelpiece when he had done so. I'm just pulling things around, he said with satisfaction. In another 12 months or so, I shall probably be out of debt, for the first time for a good 10 years. See, he leaned sideways and opened the lid of an antique mahogany desk, where the pigeonholes were stuffed with papers. Those are just a few of the bills Phyllis left behind her. The inside of the desk so strongly resembled his own, though his was of Dutch marquetry, Phyllis's present passion, that John could hardly bear to look at it. Oh, don't look so down in the mouth, old chap, said Robert kindly. It's early days yet. You must begin as you mean to go on. Curb Phyllis's mania for spending, and you may be all right. But how? Asked John, and then recoiled at the admission that this question was. Robert, however, seemed to find it natural that the second husband should ask advice of the first. After all, who could be in a better position to give it? Well, I should put her on an absolutely fixed allowance, he said judiciously, and if she buys over and above that, send the things back to where they came from. And if she won't listen to reason, put a notice in the papers to the effect that you won't be responsible for her debts. John looked at him. That's outrageous, he said. Robert laughed. John was deeply affronted. It was all so unseemly. "I didn't come here to discuss my wife with you," he said stiffly. "I'm only trying to give you a few tips," said Robert genially. "I want to help you, that's all." "I don't want any help, thank you," said John, forgetting he had asked for it. "Well, that's all right then. But one last tip I will give you, in spite of yourself. Beware of Arnold." "Arnold? Do you mean her brother?" "Yes, her brother." "But I've never seen Arnold. He's in America." "At present, yes," said Robert cryptically. "Here, what the hell do you mean, beware of Arnold?" "What I say. You'll find out. But don't part with a penny either to or for Arnold. He is a bottomless pit, is Arnold, a leaking sieve." "Oh, I think I'll be going," said John, getting up abruptly. "Just as you like. I suppose it's getting on to lunchtime." "Only no ill feelings, old chap," begged Robert, rising with the cat on his arm. "Oh, be damned to you," said John. "Where did that woman put my hat?" "In the hall, I should think," said Robert, going out with him. "Goodbye," said John abruptly. "I wish I hadn't come." "I'm sure I don't know why," said Robert mildly. "It's been so nice to see you." John plunged past the card with the crossed out misses, down the 3 steps and into the street. He boarded the empty Sunday bus. Since his marriage, he didn't take taxis unless he was with Phyllis. They cost too much. He had a long ride before him. He tried to get a flat as far away from Robert as possible. He needn't have bothered, he thought bitterly now. Robert wouldn't have minded coming across his ex-wife and friend every day of his life. John didn't mind how long this ride was. He didn't want to get home before he had somehow sorted things out in his mind. He'd always been a stickler for suitability. He liked situations and sentiments to be recognisable, cut and dried. But what could he make of Robert this morning? Robert wasn't feeling what he had expected him to feel. Had he or had he not felt a pang of envy at seeing Robert so cat-cosy, pipe-smoking, feet against the mantelpiece, carefree, so almost debtless? He didn't answer himself. He daren't. It was essential that he should get himself round again to what he had been before seeing Robert. Remorse and all, he wished he could go back. Swirling around squares, throbbing to a standstill at traffic lights, breasting the long straight roads, he worked to reassure himself, to remind himself of his happiness, or what would have been happiness if Robert hadn't spoiled it. Robert. It had been Robert before, it was Robert again now. Was he always going to let Robert ruin everything? No, he vowed. No, he was not. Robert had been very clever. He had lost Phyllis. He needed to make out that he was better off without her. It was a case of the docked fox all over again. Robert must be absolutely discounted. I shall go on as if I'd never seen him, John decided firmly, getting off the bus. This Sunday morning shall be wiped out of my memory. He looked at his watch and saw he was late. Phyllis didn't approve of his being late for meals, although, being Sunday, he knew it would be something cold out of a tin. But he was sorry to annoy her, sorry to do anything, whatever, that she didn't like. In spite of Robert, he was sorry, he told himself, rushing up the stairs. He rang his own particular ring at the flat bell and waited, contrition on his lips. But he didn't need it. Phyllis flung open the door and, kissing him, cried, "Such a lovely surprise for you, darling. Guess what?" He gazed at her mutely. "Arnold's here," she said. Do you see what I mean about so transgressive in its weird 1961 way? The story really does go in a completely different direction from where you think it's going to go, and there is no way you're expecting what's going to happen. It's why it's so memorable. On the surface, very conventional, but actually really, really shocking when you listen, and so sort of funny and intelligent. And anyway, so that was Sunday Morning by Dorothy Whipple from the second Persephone book of short stories. I hope that was kind of calming and a bit of a distraction during these crazy days for all of us. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so many of you for joining today. I hope it was super fun. A lovely way to start the day for me as well. Thank you. And thank you for all your kind comments. And I hope I will see you all for more of this, or more of something similar, or more books related stuff anyway. See you for more of it next week. I look forward to it. Thanks again for joining.